Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived just where the Avonlea main road dipped down into a little hollow, fringed with alders and ladies' eardrops and traversed by a brook that had its source away back in the woods of the old Cuthbert place. It was reputed to be an intricate, headlong brook in its earlier course through those woods, with dark secrets of pool and cascade. But by the time it reached Lynde's Hollow, it was a quiet, well-conducted little stream, for not even a brook could run past Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door without due regard for decency and decorum. It probably was conscious that Mrs. Rachel was sitting at her window, keeping a sharp eye on everything that passed, from brooks and children up, and that if she noticed anything odd or out of place she would never rest until she had ferreted out the whys and wherefores thereof. There are plenty of people in Avonlea and out of it, who can attend closely to their neighbor's business by dint of neglecting their own. But Mrs. Rachel Lynde was one of those capable creatures who can manage their own concerns and those of other folks into the bargain. She was a notable housewife. Her work was always done and well done. She ran the sewing circle, helped run the Sunday school, and was the strongest prop of the Church Aid Society and Foreign Missions Auxiliary. Yet with all this, Mrs. Rachel found abundant time to sit for hours at her kitchen window, knitting cotton warp quilts. She had knitted 16 of them, as Avonlea housekeepers were wont to tell in awed voices, and keeping a sharp eye on the main road that crossed the hollow and wound up the steep red hill beyond. Since Avonlea occupied a little triangular peninsula jutting out into the Gulf of St. Lawrence with water on two sides of it, anybody who went out of it or into it had to pass over that hill road and so run the unseen gauntlet of Mrs. Rachel's all-seeing eye. She was sitting there one afternoon in early June. The sun was coming in at the window warm and bright. The orchard on the slope below the house was in a bridal flush of pinky-white bloom, hummed over by a myriad of bees. Thomas Lynde, a meek little man whom Avonlea people called Rachel Lynde's husband, was sowing his late turnip seed on the hill field beyond the barn. And Matthew Cuthbert ought to have been sowing his on the big Red Brook field away over by Green Gables. Mrs. Rachel knew that he ought because she had heard him tell Peter Morrison the evening before in William J. Blair's store over at Carmody that he meant to sow his turnip seed the next afternoon. Peter had asked him, of course, for Matthew Cuthbert had never been known to volunteer information about anything in his whole life. And yet here was Matthew Cuthbert, at 3:30 on the afternoon of a busy day, placidly driving over the hollow and up the hill. Moreover, he wore a white collar and his best suit of clothes, which was plain proof that he was going out of Avonlea. And he had the buggy and the sorrel mare, which betokened that he was going a considerable distance. Now, where was Matthew Cuthbert going and why was he going there? Had it been any other man in Avonlea, Mrs. Rachel, deftly putting this and that together, might have given a pretty good guess as to both questions. But Matthew so rarely went from home that it must be something pressing and unusual which was taking him. He was the shyest man alive and hated to have to go among strangers or to any place where he might have to talk. Matthew, dressed up with a white collar and driving in a buggy, was something that didn't happen often. Mrs. Rachel, ponder as she might, could make nothing of it and her afternoon's enjoyment was spoiled. I'll just step over to Green Gables after tea and find out from Marilla where he's gone and why, the worthy woman finally concluded. He doesn't generally go to town this time of year and he never visits. If he'd run out of turnip seed, he wouldn't dress up and take the buggy to go for more. He wasn't driving fast enough to be going for a doctor. Yet something must have happened since last night to start him off. I'm clean puzzled. That's what. And I won't know a minute's peace of mind or conscience until I know what has taken Matthew Cuthbert out of Avonlea today. Accordingly, after tea, Mrs. Rachel set out. She had not far to go. The big, rambling, orchard-embowered house where the Cuthberts lived was a scant quarter of a mile up the road from Lynn's Hollow. To be sure, the long lane made it a good deal further. Matthew Cuthbert's father, as shy and silent as his son after him, had got as far away as he possibly could from his fellow men without actually retreating into the woods when he founded his homestead. Green Gables was built at the furthest edge of his cleared land, and there it was to this day, barely visible from the main road along which all the other Avonlea houses were so sociably situated. Mrs. Rachel Lynde did not call living in such a place living at all. It's just staying. That's what, she said as she stepped along the deep-rutted, grassy lane bordered with wild rose bushes. It's no wonder Matthew and Marilla are both a little odd, living away back here by themselves. Trees aren't much company, though dear knows if they were there'd be enough of them. I'd ruther look at people. To be sure, they seem contented enough. But then, I suppose, they're used to it. A body can get used to anything, even to being hanged, as the Irishman said. With this, Mrs. Rachel stepped out of the lane into the backyard of Green Gables. Very green and neat and precise was that yard, set about on one side with great patriarchal willows and the other with prim Lombardies. Not a stray stick nor stone was to be seen, for Mrs. Rachel would have seen it if there had been. Privately, she was of the opinion that Marilla Cuthbert swept that yard over as often as she swept her house. One could have eaten a meal off the ground without overbrimming the proverbial peck of dirt. Mrs. Rachel rapped smartly at the kitchen door and stepped in when bidden to do so. The kitchen at Green Gables was a cheerful apartment, or would have been cheerful if it had not been so painfully clean as to give it something of the appearance of an unused parlor. Its windows look east and west. Through the west one, looking out on the backyard, came a flood of mellow June sunlight. But the east one, whence you got a glimpse of the bloom-white cherry trees in the left orchard and nodding slender birches down in the hollow by the brook, was greened over by a tangle of vines. Here sat Marilla Cuthbert, when she sat at all, always slightly distrustful of sunshine, which seemed to her too dancing and irresponsible a thing for a world which was meant to be taken seriously. And here she sat now, knitting, and the table behind her was laid for supper. Mrs. Rachel, before she had fairly closed the door, had taken a mental note of everything that was on that table. There were 3 plates laid, so that Marilla must be expecting someone home with Matthew to tea. But the dishes were everyday dishes, and there was only crab-apple preserves and one kind of cake, so that the expected company could not be any particular company. Yet what of Matthew's white collar and the sorrel mare? Mrs. Rachel was getting fairly dizzy with this unusual mystery about quiet, unmysterious Green Gables. "Good evening, Rachel," Marilla said briskly. "This is a real fine evening, isn't it? Won't you sit down? How are all your folks?" Quote. Something that, for lack of any better name, Mrs. Rachel called an intuitive perception, told her that Marilla was a little on edge. The never-failing flow of small talk which usually greeted her was absent tonight, and Marilla did not look directly at her but was rather fidgety with her knitting. Mrs. Rachel was as sure that Marilla knew what Matthew was up to as if she had been told. But if Marilla chose to be silent, then Mrs. Rachel Lynde could be silent too. So she seated herself and accepted a cup of tea, which Marilla poured for her with an air of distinct preoccupation. "I was just going to sit down to supper," Marilla said. "I am expecting Matthew home every minute." "I know," said Mrs. Rachel. "I saw him driving past my house this afternoon." She paused significantly, but Marilla took no notice. "Did he get any turnip seed?" asked Marilla, after a pause of her own. "He had a quantity of turnip seed last fall," said Mrs. Rachel, still watching Marilla's face closely. "He's got as good as he wants in the seed line, if that's what you're referring to." "I wasn't referring to it," said Marilla. "I was only making a little conversation." A silence followed, and a second one, and then a third one. Finally Marilla spoke up again, evidently trying to appear unconcerned, but with a perceptible undercurrent of anxiety in her tone. "Do you want to stay to supper, Rachel?" she asked. "I could put another plate on if you do." "Thank you, but I've already had my tea," said Mrs. Rachel. "I came over to find out what Matthew was up to, for he drove by here in the middle of the afternoon and wasn't dressed as if he was going out to work, and he had the buggy and the sorrel mare, and so I knew something was up." "Matthew didn't say a word to me about it," said Marilla, looking as if she wished she didn't have to talk. "He just said he was going to take a drive and asked if I would be willing to stay home this evening. He was in a great hurry, too." "But he was dressed up," said Mrs. Rachel. "I know it," said Marilla. "I can't imagine what he was thinking of." "Well, I am sure I don't know," said Mrs. Rachel, rising to go. "And I don't suppose you know either, but if you see anything of him, I wish you'd let me know." "Certainly," said Marilla. "If I see anything of him, I'll let you know." "Good night," said Mrs. Rachel. "Good night," said Marilla. Mrs. Rachel went down the lane to the main road and turned toward home. She had not gone far before she saw Matthew Cuthbert driving slowly toward her. A solitary buggy could be seen in the distance coming up the hollow from the direction of Avonlea. It was Matthew's buggy, and Matthew himself was driving it. But his face was as blank as usual. Mrs. Rachel was sure that he was perfectly aware that she had seen him. Yet he drove right on past her, as if he had not noticed her. Mrs. Rachel was not used to being so treated. "Well, really," she said indignantly to herself. "If that doesn't beat all. There's Matthew Cuthbert going by me as if I was a tree. I guess he must be mad, and no wonder, too, with a woman like Marilla Cuthbert to live with. But I'll be glad when he gets back from his drive, so that I can hear what it's all about." Quote. As it turned out, Mrs. Rachel had to wait a good while before she heard anything. Matthew Cuthbert did not come home until after dark. He was quite alone, and Marilla was visibly relieved when she saw him. But Marilla said nothing, and Matthew was equally mute. Mrs. Rachel was left in a state of feverish anxiety and curiosity, which was not allayed until the next morning. Then she learned that Marilla had gone to town the evening before, in response to a summons from a woman named Mrs. Spencer, who had driven up from Bright River for her. Mrs. Spencer was a neighbor of Marilla's who was also very fond of talking. It was she who had brought the startling news that Marilla had adopted a girl from the orphan asylum, and that she and Matthew had gone to pick the child up and bring her home. Mrs. Rachel was intensely interested and considerably shocked. An orphan asylum, she said. Well, I'd have expected anything of Marilla Cuthbert before that. But then, she always was a peculiar woman. It must be a very peculiar child.